You're listening to the Clear Creek Resources Podcast from Clear Creek Community Church. To hear more, check out clearcreekresources.org.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining me today on the podcast. I'm Ted Ruskeski, and I'm sitting here today with, why don't you guys go ahead and actually introduce yourselves very quick.
Stephen Pittman.
I'm Derek Willis.
Larry Crochet.
Josh Yehudi.
Josh, you'll be awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. What I wanted to do is spend a little bit of time having a quick conversation around the idea of top five. That's language we use here at Clear Creek about the people in our lives that we're intentionally praying or interacting with and hoping that they would come into either a saving faith, a relationship with Jesus, or a whole host of different things. But it's just an opportunity for us to join in God's mission and what he's doing. And at Clear Creek, we've used the language top five and bless. And what's unique about you guys here is we have a little bit of a generational story of some people who had top fives, and then those guys were on a top five, and those guys were on top five. So we kind of want to unpack that a little bit. And so we really start here with you, Stephen. So for you, can you give me a little bit of idea of what was your interaction over time early on with lists of people that you were praying for, your top five lists maybe?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it started really just how God was transformational in our lives with me and Marissa, my wife. And we had biblical community through small group, and God really opened our eyes to people that didn't have that big picture, that community. And so for us, it was us sitting down and thinking through who does God have in our lives along our journey of life to that really have a potential to grow, right? To really get to experience the community that God has given us. And so for us, we took that time. We wrote down some names that we could be intentionally praying for. Through my immaturity in my faith, I kind of felt like sometimes, I was trying to produce growth, but I always, in the back of my mind, when I got really frustrated, I recognized that God was the one that really produces growth. So really for my job and my role in this was to be praying intentionally, not that I have the control, but God has the control. Mm-hmm. And so top five for me was really just opening my heart to the world around me to share God's love with others.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about what you had mentioned earlier about over time you'd have people on the list that you think like, oh yeah, I'm going to put this guy on there for that. But it's like God's like, no, this is the one where I'm maybe seeing a little bit more fruit.
Yeah, for me, like a top five was almost like, okay, number one priority is like, who do I want to be friends with? Who around me is like, hey, I could, we're gonna have, just enjoy life, right? We're gonna, really grow together. And this is a person that I perceive that really wants to grow. And almost every single time, God has redirected me and opened my eyes to say, this is not your story, this is my story. And so for the people that I thought were impossible, the people that I was like, hey, I'm just putting that name on there, those are the people that God opened those hearts.
Yeah.
And those are the people that I felt like, yes, it might have been difficult from a relationship perspective, but have been the most fruitful in my life. And so top five sometimes we can perceive it as our own list, but really God is going to open up that door with the people around us.
Yeah.
And really it's all God's work. And so we just have to plant the seeds. God does the growth.
Awesome. I will say, guys, because it's going to seem like I'm going to be talking to each one of you and like I'm only talking to you. If somebody says something you feel like jumping in, you can feel free to interrupt. This is a conversation.
Cool.
So
Yeah.
Cool.
definitely make sure. So what I'm curious, talk to me a little bit about Derek, how he ends up on your top five, and what was that initially like? And then we'll hear from Derek's perspective on that.
God really planted Derek in my life from the time I think we started the exact same day at BP.
That's right.
So we started the same day. We're engineers, opened our eyes to work and what that looks like. I was getting married around that time frame, and really God put it on me and Marissa's hearts that we needed biblical community and grow. And so at one point during that journey, maybe a couple years into work, God really put on our hearts that, hey, you guys should be navigators and be leading a group. And I remember, kind of praying over my top 5, and I was in a room with 3 other engineers, and it was like just scattering seeds every day. Like, hey, what'd you guys do this week? And oh, well, I was at small group. I was at church, and it was, once again, it was very interesting because in that moment I felt like, hey, I was scattering seeds, but I knew where the growth would transpire, but it wasn't. I still remember it. One day, Derek turns around and he's like, hey, tell me about small group. Tell me. I want to hear about it. And I was utterly shocked in my opinion because I was like, I just never thought that was the next step that Derek was thinking. And I think during your journey, you were close to being engaged, or you just got engaged to Abby. And so I think there was that connection there that we knew that we'd both be starting a marriage, in marriage, or in that sphere of a marriage, that we needed to grow, that we needed a catalyst for growth. And so I feel like that's how God planted that seed and really produced that growth.
And so do you remember what your first invitation, so he asked about small group. Was it, hey, want to come over hang out? Was it, hey, come to church? Was it, hey, small group?
No, so we just kept giving glimpses of what small group was going to look like. And then at one point, Derek was like, hey, I want to hear more about it. So we invited them over to dinner to kind of walk through what that would look like, what small group really is, right? What does that commitment look like? And really that's what took place at that dinner. And I think from that dinner, they were all in. I think that was that.
Yeah, so Derek, what do you remember about that season? Were you like, man, this guy's talking about small group an awful lot. Like, clearly he wants me to ask him about it.
Yeah, I think he mentioned, scattering seeds, and I guess thinking back on it, maybe there were some faith flags thrown out there. I never thought about it at the time. Stephen was always really winsome, and never pushed it down your throat or anything like that. And so, so you can see, like, my response was to be really on the offensive, right? Like, hey, tell me more about this. Like, you invited our coworker into small groups, but how about us? Would that work, even if we're not married, right? That kind of thing. So,
and where were you, I guess, at that point in life? I know you're a new engineer, young. You sound like you might have been engaged. Where were you in regards to your faith journey?
Yeah. So I think, like what Stephen said, getting engaged to Abby, my wife now, was definitely a catalyst for that growth. And where I was, I guess I would say a spiritual seeker. I didn't grow up in the church. I had attended Clear Creek before, but I wasn't currently attending. It wasn't something that I was put off by or anything like that. It was something that I was very open to at that time, and really even more so because I'm like, wow, I don't know how to be a husband. Maybe this married couple small group can teach me how to do that. So I don't really know what I expected. I just knew that Stephen was a guy that I liked spending time with, and that was easy to follow. So it made it pretty easy.
And so at the time, obviously you weren't aware that Stephen has a list of people he's intentionally trying to engage. And so did you ever come to that realization over time? How did that go? Was that kind of like, I guess I was on your top 5, or?
Yeah, it was after a while, and I don't remember how that got revealed or anything, but I was thinking back on it, and I don't think there was ever any any weirdness or awkwardness or anything about that. It was like, man, like, how cool is that? Because it makes you see that that God really is behind all of this, and that really He's the one that's producing the fruit. So especially through our prayers, He definitely loves to work through our prayers, and that's why top 5 is just so important.
Yeah. So talk to me about a little bit of the transition of going to the point where you're engaged in community. You go from spiritual seeker to, man, I'm living in a way where now I want to kind of be a part of God's story in other people's life. I want to do. I want to have intentional habits of engaging people in my spheres of influence.
Yeah, and so we ended up starting our own small group, and so we're fully bought into the mission. We're members of the church, and so we're trying to live into that. And so we talked about sphere of influences, and so we really tried to think about okay, who's our family and our close friends, and really you just think about concentric circles, like, and then who else do we have influence with in terms of coworkers, or in this case, it was in Larry's case, it was a neighborhood. I guess at the time I would say friend or acquaintance. We had hung out a few times, just in social settings around other folks in the neighborhood, and we had seen Larry and his wife Tiffany at church. We were at the Eager Bay campus, and so really we started to pray for them as we were thinking about starting our new group. So we started to pray for Larry and Tiffany, amongst others. But it was really like when we decided, like, okay, who's on the top 5? It's like, well, who's close? Like, really, proximity really matters. Yeah. It really mattered to us, and so and it still does today. So that's kind of how this thread started.
Yeah. And so was that a specific ask? Like you get to the point where like, hey, Larry, we want to ask you, would you consider being a part of this community, this group with us?
Yeah. So we decided to have Larry and Tiffany over for dinner. I think we might have lured you under false pretenses.
Yeah, definitely some false pretenses.
Yeah.
I think everybody
don't do
except
that.
for me. Everybody.
Definitely, if you're going to make the invitation, like at least let them know, like, hey, we're going to talk about small group. So yeah, I think I learned that lesson.
Yeah. What do you remember from that?
First, I just remember my wife approaching me saying, the Willises down the street invited us over for dinner. And I just was like, the Willises. I was like, oh, Derek and Abby, okay. And that's when it finally clicked. I was like, well, that's awesome. Let's go. And as soon as we started sitting down and we started, Derek started opening up about small group, and I realized at that point that I was like, oh, this is set up. At this point,
Bait and switch.
Yeah. And there was some very, very good conversation besides speaking about small group, but for the most part, I didn't have a very good concept. We had just started the church probably a few months prior, so my understanding of small group was a very, very rudimentary at the time. So when he was speaking on discipleship and those things, my definition of discipleship was completely different than a biblical aspect of it, which I thought at this point, I'm going to need some type of collateral. I'm going to be wearing a suit, maybe have to grab a bike or something. I will be knocking on doors. That was my understanding. So I completely had a misconcept of what that looked like. And to hear now, even just listening to y'all two, is this, it's so rewarding, and also how God knew I needed something and utilized others to do that for me, and to pray for me in those moments.
Yeah.
And it's just emotional to think about it right now, that I'm blessed in that aspect by Him. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where were you? Ultimately you ended up saying yes, your wife, and you joined that small group. But where would you say, or how would you describe where you were in your faith journey at that point?
I was definitely, if there's a scale, I was definitely a kindergartner.
Yeah.
At that point,
I say yeah,
God.
like I know. I'm like
Yeah.
I can tell.
I definitely came in expecting to be able to just sit back and listen, not contribute, and that's what I did a lot of the time. But for the most part, that's when I realized I didn't have an understanding that I needed. I didn't have that community. I didn't have somebody consistently talking into me, and then consistently being loved on, and man, I missed that. So, for 30 years of my life, 30-something years of my life, I completely missed that, and I didn't know that was something that I needed, or somebody needed to be praying for me in that aspect to do that. And man, I was saying things in the middle of group that just everybody would just look at me and amazed that I was just catching on to, like, just picking up the Bible. And I just remember stopping group, and I slammed my Bible down, and I looked around and I said, man, this is a book of love. He continued. And everybody was like, yeah, Larry, that's what we've been saying the whole time. We're 6 months into this, bud. You're just catching on. But at that moment, I felt it.
Yeah.
I felt it, and it was true to the core, and the Holy Spirit was moving in me in that. And I just had to, luckily, everybody was very patient with me in the sense that as I was growing, I was growing at a different pace of everybody else, but I was so new in it that things that I was catching on to, it was emotionally involved for me.
Yeah.
At that point.
So initially, Derek, at that meal, what you said is he's talking about discipleship, and it sounds like you're starting to play that out. Did you ever have this realization? It's like make that connection, like, oh, this is what he was talking about. I mean, you kind of just said a second ago, but I'm curious how you would articulate that. Was there an aha moment of like, man, I'm being discipled, and I want to start being a part of this. I want to disciple others.
And that came along with the top 5, 100%. And to, like Derek was saying, intentionally find others that I could do the same for that has been done for me.
Yeah.
You know, people that prayed for me, I want to be able to do that for others. And man, I have a beautiful spouse in my wife, and she was ahead of me in that aspect of my faith. And she'd already identified a few couples that we could be praying for, and especially their spouse. When I say that, the gentlemen in that relationship, the ones that were just like me, that were kind of late to the game, to say. And so, and in that case, that kind of brings me to Josh here. Is that one evening she was in a women's small group, said, "Hey, I have a woman in my small group. They just moved down here from Dallas not too long ago. I'd like to invite them over for dinner." There was no context about joining small group when initially, but
yeah, I'm not going to make that same mistake he did.
But I knew going into the situation that he had an understanding of faith, but he wasn't growing in it, and he didn't. I knew that his wife wanted what for him. Basically what was done for me. Yeah. So I knew that going into that. So organically, I let conversation materialize over a couple of meetings. For the most part, almost the first one initially, God moved in that conversation and allowed us to speak on that topic and come off salty, not cringy. Yeah. And be able to speak into the Yehudi family that night.
So now here you are. You have a list of people. Josh is on that list. You're praying for him. You guys are developing a relationship, and so you end up you're in small group together.
That's correct.
Yeah, and so Josh, tell me a little bit about you're on this guy's list. He's praying for you, and you're showing up. And what do you remember early on about that?
Well, it was I think the movement from my top 5 to actually away from being on his top 5 was a little bit before I joined small group. I would say, we started hanging out. It was a very organic, kind of like you said. My wife and his wife were friends. Let's go hang out, have dinner, and kind of spend some time together. And I was like, all right, it's cool. He's a cool guy. Hang out, have a good time, and. That's kind of how it started. And then my wife made the ask, hey, let's join small group and, live in community. And I was like, I don't know what this looks like. I believe in God. I believe, Jesus is Savior. But I didn't realize what in community with other believers look like. And so I started that and started hanging out with both him and Derek and immediately realized what discipleship looked like and realized that, this is what living in a Christian faith and Christian based group setting looks like. And that was for me was I think the light bulb flipped on very quickly. And hearing all of this, hearing from Stephen to Derek to Larry to me, just kind of how it all transpired is like, wow, that's really cool how it all worked down the line. And so I started very quickly jumping into the mission and trying to really jumping in full-fledged to see what I could do and how I could do this.
Yeah, you were definitely a dragster. You floored it. It was amazing. It was good to see it.
And it was surprising to my wife. She looked at me and she said, if you had asked me this is what you were going to be doing a year ago, I would not have believed that.
Yeah.
So
So what was it, I guess, that you remember from, you said you had, a faith in Jesus, but you weren't really living into biblical community. So you
No.
experienced that. What was it about that kind of maybe lit a spark, or what was it that happened? You're like, no, this is what I want to be about.
I think it was I'm trying living in the community and having people that had the same faith. I had that faith and I had that feeling, but I never had anybody to I guess to live in it with, to confess to, and
You weren't like living on an island anymore. This is something you're
Exactly.
you're experiencing biblical community.
exactly. I was in with these people. We were living together, and not living together, literally,
We were doing life together.
But you're right.
Definitely doing life.
There's definitely a social aspect to
Sure.
belief, right? Like you had the intellectual to some extent. You had the intellectual. You assented, right, to God. And,
Yeah.
And you'd heard the gospel, and it's like you didn't have that social aspect. You probably had a personal need as well.
No,
I don't know
that
if
was
you would
definitely the
articulate
case.
it that way necessarily at that time.
I didn't realize I had the personal need for it until I got into it. I was like, wow, this is something that I really needed, and something that I would hope that other people that around me would realize they needed as well.
Yeah, and that's part of why top five. I mean, that some of that for each of us, it's a different thing that we articulate. That is the motivator for us to be like, man, it's either what I'm experienced, what God's done in my life, or this aspect that helps us recognize, man, I want other people that I know to either experience this too or have this experience. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious, just as kind of all you guys, like we're sitting here talking, I mean, this is how long ago was it that Derek was on your top five? When did you start when did you start at BP?
2008.
2008. I think it was 2010 timeframe, I believe, when we started our group. So over 13 years ago.
Yeah, so 13 years ago, you have a list of people you're praying for. He's one of them. He's got a list of people. And so it just, I think for me, my mind starts to go crazy just thinking of not just the multiplication of it, but the tree that comes down, just how it starts. You guys have any thoughts of,
Just sitting
it's
here
like
at this
to be a part
table,
about that?
I'm hoping to have a conversation with the person that God can speak to me and put next to me. That next person that I can help disciple and bring to the Lord. That's what I would like to see.
Yeah,
That's really cool. That gave me chills.
and just recently, me and my wife just started up a small group, and there's several individuals that were on my top five in that group.
Yeah.
And I'll just never forget sitting in church, and then we had a sermon on top five, and they started attending church, which was amazing. To even have him in our group was even above anything. It's only God's movement at that point. And I just remember when he looks down the row at me when they were speaking on top five, and he's like, he points at me and he points back, and like, I was on yours, wasn't I? And I said, yes, you were.
Yeah.
And he had an aha moment for himself. And then that day he made a top five list for himself.
Yeah.
And I said, man, it's amazing when somebody prays and loves on you, and you don't even know it.
Yeah.
That God is moving in that on a consistent basis, continuously doing.
You guys have any thoughts of hearing kind of this generational story of just living on mission and how that kind of plays out down in lives? I mean, what's crazy is, all you guys have families, you have friends. I mean, just the ripples that kind of come from us, like you said, gives me chills. It's like, man, it's crazy.
I mean, I think for me, just listening to these stories is the gospel is a gift, right? It's a gift that we can't earn, but that God has given us freely. And it's wild to me to think that we have Christians that are out there that believe that the gospel is a gift that you hold tightly to yourself and not share. And I'm appreciative that each and every one of these men, when they received that gift, they recognize that gift really is fruitfulness is in community, and community within people that believe, but in people that need church community. And I can't imagine just listening to this now, thinking through it, is what would a gospel look like without community, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that is the gospel at that point. And so just hearing that's just tremendous to see how God has worked through each and every one of us, right? That our hearts are open to community and to grow and to share what God has given us freely that we didn't clearly deserve, but has been transformational in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think God a while back kind of planted a vision in my mind, really about gospel saturation in our neighborhood. And so, like, I'd always thought about, I think we're on our 6th group now, but I'd always thought about, like, what would it look like to have multiple small groups in our neighborhood. And, like, that's why I was saying earlier, like, proximity is such a big deal. When we talk about sphere of influence, I mean, the people in your neighborhood, like, that's how you, I mean, that's who you live with. That's how you do community, not live with. But I mean, but like, I mean, it was like 2016 time frame when we started group, right? And then what happened in 2017? I think that's when we started to get closer and kind of deepen our relationship. Was not only launching the East 96 campus together, which we did, right? But also Hurricane Harvey. Mm-hmm. And I think how the communities banded together, especially neighborhoods, and like you see bold love lived out, and we're serving the community, and really doing it together, kind of as a missional community, really. And so I think we've seen some of the fruit from just being neighbors, but also being really good friends. And then allowing that to spill over into some of our other neighbor friends, right, that have been in group with us, and now they're in group with you, and we've seen kind of some multiplication there in terms of just bearing out fruit.
Yeah. So, I mean, for some people listening, I mean, clearly we knew a little bit about this, so we asked you guys to come, but I don't know that this is everybody's top 5, so that everybody can point down the line and see the kind of generational impact. And so I'm curious, has there been seasons for some of you, maybe more seasoned guys, who have had maybe lists of top 5 where it didn't maybe go as you planned, or it was a lot harder? It's like, no, this guy's still been on there since before this, or this gal, or I'm just trying to give some. It's not always up and to the right, maybe.
I mean, I have a person on my top 5 right now that it's a very challenging. I pray for him every day, and it's a very challenging relationship that I have, and even being very new to having a top 5, it's tough, because there are days where I feel very, I feel very challenged to have him, hopefully come to hear the same good news that I heard and come to the same faith that I have. So it can definitely be challenging for me.
Yeah, I know my wife, Megan, and I have some couples around us that are on our top 5. And, it's funny. Sometimes, it can be discouraging. Like, man, I wish God would give us more opportunities to interact with them or have more conversation. And so I know for me, it's not always up and to the right, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and that's where, like, that bless framework really comes in handy too, right? Like, yes, we begin with prayer. We begin with praying for our top 5, but like Stephen did, and then like I did, and then how we did for you is like we got on the table. You got around the table, and we shared a meal, and we had good conversation. And I think whenever we're praying for our top 5, it's important that we celebrate wins. It's like, I know we're praying that they're going to come to saving faith in Jesus. That's ultimately what we want. But it's also a win, man, if we can get them to come to a church picnic.
Yeah.
Right? Or if we can serve them in some way.
Sure.
And I think it's helpful to use that framework. Maybe we can share our story with them, right? Just to use that bless acrostic and celebrate wins. Because, yeah, like you said, it's not always.
Sometimes we're just praying for them to say more than hello and a wave as you're like walking into the house. So,
yes.
You mentioned the bless acrostic. I will say, if you were to go to clearcreekresources.org, like up in the top right by the little hamburger, there's a little icon that says like bless. If you just click on that, I know that takes you to a page where there's more conversation stuff about top 5, but it's like how to identify a list. What does that bless acrostic stand for? So there are some resources for those of you who are listening. If you're like, I want to know more about maybe some of the practical ways of how to develop that list, you can get that there. We're running close to an end on time. I don't know if you're about to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to, and for those that are, I call them my OGs, the ones that's been on my top 5 for a while, don't give up on them.
Yeah.
You never know how God's moving in their life.
Yeah.
And if you continuously pray for them, God is working in that life, and you just don't know what that looks like for them. And then one day He'll reveal it into a table like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wouldn't stop too at a top 5, right? It's the way that you open your heart for God to open up doors to have conversations with people that you're intentionally relationally with, but you don't realize it when you're scattering seeds. There could be growth that you never knew that occurred for someone that maybe not been there. So I would always expand the scope, right?
Yeah.
Always be prepared. And back to what Derek said, pray, right? What that is doing is that's preparing your heart for all situations. And so for the situations with your top 5, and then someone that might randomly come in your life that might be, you might impact later on. So just have your heart prepared and really understand what is the motivation for the gospel, right? And have that heart and be prepared for it to be outwardly compared to inwardly focused.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I'm grateful for just your story, and I just pray that it's an inspiration, and continue to see more people on our top 5s that enter into biblical community, come to faith, and so we're excited about that. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for checking out this video. If you haven't yet, make sure that you hit subscribe down below and check out ClearCreekResources.org, where we have videos, books, and sermons on there, as well as our audio podcast. Thanks for watching.